Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Samira Tilley, Marketing Manager at Assemble Systems. Our webinar today will cover how Skanska uses Assemble for collaboration between design and construction. Now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Tim Kelly, Director of Partnerships at Assemble. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Samira. Today, I want to welcome Chester Bailey to conversation. We're going to walk through some brief introductions of myself and Chester, as well as Assemble Systems and Skanska. And then Chester's going to be diving into their use case and what they're doing around working with design teams and on their projects, some of the things that they're doing with Assemble, as well as some of the partners of Assemble. So we're going to be stepping through a couple of those key points, features and integrations, and then from there we'll dive into some questions. With that said, as Samir mentioned, I'm Tim Kelly. I've been with Assemble for a number of years, but prior to that, I worked with the general contractor with a degree out of Texas A&M in construction science. My focus has been for my career around BIM. Working both in pre-construction and in construction, and now on the software side. But with that said, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Chester Bailey.
All right, I'm excited to present today, and hopefully share some valuable thoughts that I have, according to what Skanska's up to and how we're utilizing Assemble. And my background primarily has been on the design side, working, in the architecture field of the industry. So, making more of a transition to construction. I've kind of got to sit on both sides of the table, you might say. So I feel like I have kind of like a unique perspective in that aspect, and hopefully I can share some of my insights throughout the webinar. So let's proceed, shall we?
Yeah. So funny enough as well, Chester and I are both based out of Houston, Texas. And when preparing for the webinar, I didn't realize before, but he worked for a design firm that my company worked with frequently. And oddly enough, we're not sure, but it's very likely that we actually worked on a few projects together on opposite sides of the model. But with that said, I actually want to do a brief introduction of Assemble. Assemble Systems is what we consider ourselves to be a system of engagement. What we want to do is allow our users to easily organize model content and information around different workflows that they have within their organization, and key partnerships or organizations that they also work with. In our case, we heavily integrate with Autodesk, Sage, Procore, Oracle, and iSquareFoot. We have a number of others that we're pursuing and looking at, and making it easy to move data between Assemble and other systems that you leverage to manage your projects. We are in around 1,000 offices across the U.S. and around the world, and we have about, I think this slide is a little bit old, but about getting close to 15,000 users in our system, and more and more projects every day. So that's kind of the basics of Assemble. So Chester, do you mind giving some introduction of Skanska?
Absolutely. So, Skanska was founded late 1800s. We like to build what matters, and global revenue 2017 we were at 18.8 billion. We've got 41,000 plus employees across the globe. When we look at Skanska USA, we here in the U.S. we did 7 billion in 2017. We've got 31 offices. A lot of the offices that I work with are all of the Texas area, Phoenix, Cincinnati, Nashville, some of the other offices as well. So we've got a large number of employees in the U.S. as well, and we're the 7th largest contractor in the U.S. Really, to get into the gist of the presentation, it's about collaboration and the importance between design and construction. So there's obviously a lot of benefits to collaboration and why we want to be involved. Obviously the project cost, the schedules, improving the bottom line, really, making sure that we achieve the owner's vision with the design team. And I think most importantly is, building the healthy relationships between project teams, which basically allow all of those other things to happen.
Yeah, real quick too, and kind of you mentioned your history as on the design side and where you are today. I'll kind of weigh in and say, from my experience, it always felt like as part of the VDC team or BIM group, we were sort of the liaison between, keeping peace, I'll say, between the design team and our project management team or estimating teams. And I'm just curious, having experienced both sides, do you feel that you have a little more sympathy or a little more peacekeeping capability when working with designers Skanska works with?
I think the sympathy and trying to look at it, from somebody else's perspective is key to understanding where they're coming from. And so I do think once you've experienced both, you probably have a lot more sympathy towards the other side, and hopefully you can see what it's like to fill their shoes and then have a more collaborative environment. So you don't want it to be like adversarial, like, hey, you sit on this side of the table, we're going to sit over here, and we're going to hash things out the hard way. I mean, it's all about the relationship. So I mean, we're here, we're going to talk about software, but really the key to success is not really necessarily the software or the workflows. It's the relationships that you build with across teams.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And I think a software kind of at times enables or enhances the collaboration process, but it's absolutely about the relationships you build. So we can digress from talking about relationships, but I'll let you dive back into to your slides here.
Hey, no worries. Actually, with this slide we've currently got up right now, a little graphic here. Typically, when the project starts out, from concept over time to get into, GMP, there's a gap in between the designer's cost understanding and what their vision is of the design and the construction manager's design understanding. And so the goal really is to, make sure that that gap doesn't exist, by the time you get to GMP, and that you have a shared design and cost vision. And the key to that, again, not necessarily software so much as it is, the relationships and, maintaining the conversation. So if you're not, sitting at the table, then, if you're just, stuck in your silo, you're never going to get there. Another thing about the industry everyone's, probably well aware of is that the contracts really define, how we're going to work together. As much as, relationships are important, the contracts also, really have a key factor in the way that the projects are built. So typically when we're looking at the documentation side of things, or even, like the model and BIM, it's going to be a lot to deal with, the contracts. And so the trust primarily of the information is set in the 2D construction documents, and not necessarily in the BIM model. So I know, early on it was really difficult to want to give up the models to the construction side, because you feel like you're basically letting people peek behind the curtain to see how you produce all of your documentation, and there's obviously some liability there. And so typical in the industry is you got to sign a release to get the model, and that's something that even today, depending on what part of the country you're in, now being on the construction side, it can be difficult to get those models from the designers. And so that's one of the things I want to talk about more. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly the same point we were talking about earlier of the relationships. When when you're in a situation where you're sharing documentation that can open you up and provide any sort of exposure, and you're at risk of someone taking advantage of that exposure, and you're not exactly sure what they're using the content for, other than could be potentially a weapon down the road. It immediately creates a poor relationship, and if you don't foster the communication, the connection that you have across both parties, then you can be in that situation. But just for clarification, if you were to say out of your office here and supporting the projects you support, what would be the primary contract structure you deal with? Are you dealing more with like CM at risk, or what might it be?
Yeah, I would say primarily CM risk. We might get into a little bit more, a little bit more design build, and then
Sure.
different parts of the country, they're dealing with different types of delivery methods. So one thing that coming from the construction side, you might not be aware of is that Revit is this great tool, and it does phenomenal. It's a phenomenal building information modeling tool. But when you're on the design side, you typically don't spend all of your time building the model. I mean, yes, you work in the model, you jump back and forth from your 2D documentation and your 3D model, but really that model is more of a tool to create the documents. And so you might have hundreds of sheets within the Revit file, and you're spending a lot of your time still dealing with the 2D elements. And so it's something that I think a little bit you lose something in the translation of BIM when we rely purely on the documentation. But again, that's what the contracts revolve around, and so that's where the designers have to spend a lot of their time making sure that they get it right. So
Right, and I mean, we both, and I'm sure we've all heard our fair share of conversations or presentations around garbage in, garbage out, and at the end of the day, from the contractor side, you have to remember that most often the sole purpose of the model for the designer is to create the construction documents and produce that set. And at times there is some deliverable that includes the model itself, but more often than not, it doesn't. And so what's the purpose of creating the model content? And you have to keep that in mind, that it's maybe not necessarily built to load cost codes in and manage that data. So you have to think about how you can organize that data, or think about that data as a team. And a lot of those conversations, I think you have this later on in your presentation, but a lot of those conversations need to happen as early as possible. So.
Oh, for sure, yeah. So we'll definitely be talking more about data. I mean, because that's pretty much the way that the world is going nowadays. My vision for the future, obviously, is to reduce the number of 2D documentations and really increase use of the BIM information models, and go that route. However long it takes, we'll see. And obviously, it depends on a lot of factors in the industry. So
right,
but the construction side isn't always at the, depending on the project delivery method, the construction guys, they don't get involved until a little bit later in the game, and sometimes we feel like we kind of missed the boat on putting together the perfect BIM execution plan. And so, best have your addendum that you can, hopefully add to that. And, typically when we, get on a project, they're already in SD or DD, we're going to obviously ask, hey, can we see what the BIM execution plan is, and see what we can do there. And if there's something where we wanted to see if we can get some more information or work more collaboratively, that's, can we add to that BIM execution plan? Is it more of a living document, or is it, set in stone? I know from the design side, we used to, have it be more of like, hey, this is a living document. We're going to go in and make changes as, push comes to shove. Deadlines are tight and things like that. I mean, you may go back to the BIM execution plan, but I mean, really, it comes down to hitting your milestones, whether you're on the design side or on the construction side further down the pipeline. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, keeping in mind the objective of delivering a project is the building, not the virtual building, and so it has to fall in line with what those expectations are. So,
speaking of information, I'm sure everybody's well aware of the growing number of Revit libraries that are available online. I mean, we've got manufacturers coming on board and creating their components, and on the design side, we obviously try to vet that, bring in relevant information, but again, those models might be just loaded with tons of manufacturer information that can be a little bit excessive at times. Sometimes you'll get components that are just bloated with so much information, that you don't really know what to do with, and it doesn't even get utilized most of the time. So
I actually gonna jump in. I think, as you're saying, excessive. I think what you're meaning is irrelevant data, right? If a model component's loaded and the spec is requiring something different than the data that's in that model itself, why do you have that data there, and what do you need to get cleaned up?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, the spec is really what's going to drive it. And, you might have downloaded something from online, and it's not necessarily pertinent to the project. But one thing, like the information that is, in the example we've got on screen here, is, a revolving door. And, what we might care about on the construction side when we're trying to do, model-based estimating based off of that is the family name. We want to know what it is. Type name, I've heard, both sides that, hey, that's important or it's not. In this example, we've got a height and width in the type name, and it's obviously those parameters are available, so that is not quite as pertinent as the family name. So, the information is there. You want to make sure that you're getting the right information, though. So, again, that goes back to communicating with design. Are you tying in your specs to the model? I mean, that's a little bit more advanced, and it takes more time to do that. But sometimes you might be on a project where they do have that, and so you want to be in communication with design to know what information is pertinent. So,
while you're still on that, there's a question and comment that came in, and it relates exactly to what you're saying there. And it says, BIM is truly effective only truly effective when the asset manager or client stipulates that the requirements and the reuse of that data, or the intelligence there, are used to manage the asset. The industry's not totally there yet.
No.
So, what we're talking about right now is delivering a project. But from Skanska's point of view, do you see that the industry is changing and that there's more use or more focus on getting us there?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to that, going back to the BIM execution plan and then talking to the owners and making sure, how are they going to utilize that information? It could be in a facilities maintenance model at the end, but the information that you want to track, you really want to pinpoint early on in the project before you even start your first model, whether it's COBie or some form of other system. So having that up front, knowing what the expectations are key to knowing what you need to deliver on. And one thing that I think is really important when it comes to communication is scheduling. So a lot of times we'll get the design team's models, and we can see, if they haven't deleted them, all the schedules that are in there, and then we can really see, well, what information did they care about? What did they think was important when they were going through the design process? And a lot of that same stuff is things that we care about on the construction side. So that can be a valuable way of seeing what information they've gone through and verified to be accurate. We obviously want to make sure that for modeling purposes, that the information that is needed can be scheduled. That's just a quick check. So you can go in and you can do a model in place and just do some phenomenal models, but if it doesn't have square footage or linear foot, or you can't get an accurate count, if everything is modeled as one single object versus individual entities, then it's not going to be beneficial to your estimate. So that there's some communication there that needs to happen between construction and design. When you see stuff, pop up, if you're early on in the project, you can say, hey, I know you model it like this, but before you get too far along, would it be okay if you model it in this way? And so part of that comes down to, using the tools that are kind of available to you. And sometimes you do have to get a little creative. Sometimes, we'll see models come in, and I'll hear from some of our estimators like, well, they use the wall for, a roof or not, or a floor and a ceiling, and, it's in the wrong category. How do I handle this? The cool thing about Assemble is that it doesn't even matter how, what tool they use to create that, as long as it's getting the pertinent information like square footage out of it. There's ways that you can group and digest that information and assemble. It makes it super easy to overcome, little small obstacles that you might see. So I've been using Revit since like the early 2000s, like shortly after Autodesk purchased it. As powerful as schedules are, there's definitely some limitations. And one that's always been really annoying is the fact that you have to have a separate Revit schedule for each category. And you can have a multi-category schedule, but the number of parameters that are available to you are very limited. And it's always been a challenge getting the information to show correctly in the schedules that you want. And so there's all these workarounds and things that you have to deal with. So the nice thing about Assemble that I really, like, is when we first, to be honest, when I first got into Assemble, I was like, why would I even need Assemble? Because I already have Revit, and I am like super power user, so there's no way I would want to utilize a tool like Assemble. And the more I learned about it, my perception and thought process changed. And part of it had to do with being able to get access to the information within the model. Now, something that I really like about Assemble is that you can have a combined inventory view, and you can set up essentially those same schedules that the designers are, and see in the model that you have more control over what the information looks like and how you can best utilize it.
Just to jump in there, you kind of talked about being a power user of Revit, and kind of I put myself in that category too. But I hear that question all the time when we're talking to customers. It's okay, what are the differences between Revit and Assemble? And really, Assemble is geared to be a tool for a contractor to classify and categorize, organize things the way they want to see it. There are a lot of things that do overlap, but the primary purpose and one of the key benefits is that you can teach a lot of people how to use Assemble in a very short order, a short period of time. Their functions and features in Assemble our key focus is ease of use. And so the idea is that it's not all on Chester to create all of the schedules and the data, but the entire estimating team can be spun up and start using the system very quickly. That allows you to access all of this information. We federate models together, so if your designers are working in 8 different models, you can put all of those into the same data table and same view. And then you can query across all of that data consistently, however you key in your cost code information or your bid package information or your work packages, whatever it may be. You have that consistent set of parameters across all models, and irrelevant of the model version or revision of that file. We're an object-based database, and so that means that all of this information can kind of live even though the model is being updated, version to version there.
Yeah, there's definitely some huge benefits to working in Assemble, and my preference now is, hey, if I'm not modeling, then there's no reason for me to be in Revit. I mean, I've got all the information I need through Assemble, plus I have a lot more control, and I'll get into that a little bit more here in the presentation. You have converted me, Tim, so I'm here doing this webinar, yes, obviously. I'm going to go through real quick on these next couple of slides, just kind of show some examples, and then what I wanted to do is I wanted to dive in and, show off some of the basics in Assemble for those that might not be aware of. So this is an example of, color by phase. So I really like the, some of the features that are available in Assemble just to help highlight different parts of the model and the information in the model, make it more of a visual tool. Coming from the design side, I think this is hugely powerful. Here's another one where we're looking at classifying MEP systems and, work with our estimators and making sure that they know how to divide the model up, because a lot of times they get mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all those trades in one model, and yet they only care about certain pieces of it. And Assemble does a great job, letting you have control over the information you want to see. One thing that people aren't necessarily aware of if you're not, working in Revit or haven't worked in Revit is that, what are work sets and, how the project is divided up. It's kind of like a rudimentary layer system, and they're kind of a bane in Revit too, because you'll get people that will model stuff in the wrong work set all the time. And so from a designer's perspective, like, I would love to, yeah, you can do this in Revit, but like, it's just so much easier in Assemble to set up those views and help, kind of do quality control with your design team. So that's definitely something that I think is valuable when the construction manager is making that information available back to the design team. They can do a little bit of quality control. Room schedules, a lot of the information is in the rooms, and if you work in Revit, you know that those aren't necessarily in 3D, but when you pull that over into Assemble, you get a nice 3D model for the room volumes and all of the information that is contained in those. And early on in the project, those are very beneficial to understanding the scope and the program of the project, and putting together early estimates based off of the information that's in there. So let's jump over to Assemble.
While you're pulling that up, I do want to say earlier you mentioned kind of some troubleshooting or problem solving as you're looking at different models, and that's a key thing here. Is as you're doing that model investigation and sort of interrogating what's been put into the model, sometimes the finishes for walls or ceilings might be put into those objects. Sometimes it's in the room schedule. Sometimes it's elsewhere. And a key component here, and I think you might be showing this here in a second, but a key component is how flexible it is to actually do that interrogation and understand what's there, where is it, what are the properties associated, and what's most important to me, and then build your views and your content around that.
So just kind of a brief overview. I know some people are probably already, Power Assemble users and stuff, but to my point with collaboration, you have the information in the Revit models. The way that it's, digested and accessible on the design side is primarily through the schedules. We can recreate those exact same schedules in Assemble so that we can kind of see things from their perspective. And, that's what these views are right here. So we can create these views. Essentially, it's a schedule like it is in Revit, but you've got that visual aspect tied back to the model. And, over here on the left-hand side, you've got your models that are all available, and then these are the individual views that you can save out and customize and highlight different parts of the information. So I've already got them kind of opened up in some of the tabs here, but this is kind of like if I were to just open up or load in a model, you've got all of your Revit categories available here in the model tree for those that are familiar with how Revit kind of like breaks stuff down. Your inventory panel right here, which has a lot of the information available to you. You've got your basic, quantities, uniform, units, some of the other metrics that are pertinent when you're trying to come up with your calculations for your estimate. Something that, a lot of people don't realize is this is like super customizable. I mean, more so than you ever could, do in Revit. So the limitations that Revit has, this definitely exceeds what you can do. So some key areas that I always like to make sure that our users are aware of is that, you've got your visibility settings. So in Revit, you kind of have something similar where you can turn on or off different categories and filter, different things out of the view that you might not want to see. Your column control here. So here you can add, remove columns, and columns are essentially just the parameters themselves. So going back to the limitation that Revit has, I mean, you can add any parameter from any of the models to that column. It might not have information in each one of those depending on the type of object, but that's a huge limitation that Revit has. And so I really like the fact that you can do that. Another thing is your group by. And so by default, it's going to go in and it's going to group everything based off of your Revit default category. So here you can see, all the different components that are in the model. You can, select them in here. They'll highlight in your model view. But this can be changed so that it can start to quantify and add things up. So in the case of like, you're looking at square footage, you want to see things, the numbers based off of level. That's just a simple one. We come in here, you can see like we've got all these. This one might work. Yeah, we have an excessive number of.
Yeah, that watching you do that, I'll kind of make a note that that's something that on our roadmap we're actually looking at a cleanup of how groupings work, and just to make it simplified. You can always have lots of flexibility there, but if it's hard to get to, we certainly want to know about it and clean it up.
Just a simple little search function right there would be helpful. Yeah, let's jump over into some other views. So here we've got a view set up. This is looking, at the structural model, but it's basically set up to utilize some of the other functions here. So we are, grouping based off of phase created. And so I've got, my existing conditions. This project was built in multiple phases. And so if I want to get my quantities based off of that, I can go in and pull that information. Now, a lot of times we'll get models, and they'll be existing conditions, and so those will be modeled, but we don't want those to be added to the, the totals in our counts. And so one way is you can make sure that your grouping is, pulling that information out, so you can see the totals in your other areas and make sure that those get pulled out. When I first started using the symbol, I was like, well, how am I going to deal with that? Do I have to go into Revit and try and export this information out so that I'm only getting just the phases that I want? And you don't even have to bother with that, because based off of the grouping or going into the visibility settings, you can filter that information out so you're only getting the information you had. A couple months back, I was working with one of our team members, and they had everything set to by category, and then they wanted to go back in and they did all this like crazy, like cool stuff in Excel to like get the quantities to add up. And I was like, hey, let me show you this little button here, and show you, where you can automatically get a symbol to group and give you the total quantities for you. And I mean, that's just a simple tool, but it's a huge time saver. The colors, however, those are based off of color by property. Say that we're conditioning the model data. This is hugely important to be able to do that, because you can basically pick any parameter, and then it will automatically create colors based off of that. So if you've got different levels, going back to like the level one, like that search function there, that works. It'll update, and you get to see a nice rainbow of your model based off of whatever parameters you have set there. That, I think, is really important when it comes to working with like some of the MEP systems and starting to divide that out. I mean, obviously you can go into the model tree and turn on and off, certain parts of the model that you're not going to need, depending on what discipline you're working on. You can go back in and you can, check about or group things based off of its, system classification and start to pull out pertinent information. So really, really beneficial. While we're on this MEP model, you'll notice that if I kind of zoom back out on the project here, you'll notice that, hey, we've got some gaps. This is a core and shell project. I probably should have mentioned, at the beginning, this is our Capitol Tower project. It's downtown Houston, and it's one of our commercial development projects. So Skanska, obviously we're a construction company, but we do have a commercial development arm as well. So this is one of our projects. But you'll notice that in the model here, not everything gets modeled. And so, I mean, that's part of like going in and vetting the model, because the design team might not necessarily go in and create a view and replicate that information because it's so repetitive. And so in order to get, your accurate model-based takeoff, you need to be aware of, hey, what's being modeled, what's not, and then, once I get that information per level, you can then, extrapolate and use that information to get your totals.
Yeah, and just to jump in really quick, there's a question that came in earlier that actually kind of relates to this, and the question is two parts, but it says, so is this IFC Federation, and would Skanska use a symbol for validation of submission data? First part of it is, I mentioned federation earlier, organizing models in one container. With Assemble, you have the ability to aggregate models from Revit, all flavors, same with AutoCAD, so MEP, architecture, etc., Civil 3D, CADWorks, and some other systems coming online soon. But what you notice on the left side of his page in the model tree, he's only currently got the MEP1 turned on. There may be some others down below, but those could be any models. And the way we import from each of the way we publish from those systems, you have the ability to then aggregate data across models. So if you have pipes coming in from AutoCAD and pipes coming in from Revit, you can summarize all of that information together. And then the second part of the question is around validating data. Chester started to mention that, but we do have a number of ways that our users validate information through Assemble. But Chester, do you want to weigh in on how you guys use some of that validation?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm kind of, that's a little bit further in the presentation, but let me just jump through here, and we'll I know we're getting short on time here. This is the work set one. Here's the room one. This is probably a good one to go in and at least talk about how you might want to validate the data, or maybe it's not. It's rooms, but it is set up based off of the color coding. So when I'm going to go through, let's see here. Let's say that we wanted to assign. Obviously we're not going to assign a room to a bid package or location or whatever. Maybe let's change this to one of our Assemble parameters. So let's just change that to location. So my color by property, I like the fact that the not assigned is white. And if I come in here and I select on any one of the rooms and I go into the properties panel, if I wanted to just add a value to that, it's essentially the same as like a Revit instance parameter. It now color codes that. So if I go in and I select different parts of the model and I'm filling in some other information, it starts to color code the model for you. So I think that's a great tool. Another thing you could do is, like, once you've added that, you could probably, usually I leave the colors on so I can see it, but you may be able to go into the visibility settings and say, hey, if you've got a parameter, go in and only show information that's showing blank versus the other information, so it starts to hide part of the model as well. So that's
a lot of flexibility you're showing, is whether you want things color coded as you go or shown or hidden as you go. One question actually you were illustrating there, and I want to call it out really quick while you were showing it. There's a question around editing properties within Assemble. We have two groups of properties. One is the model-based properties that come out of the modeling system. You can edit the properties that are not parametric or geometric-based. And so if you're in an object, you can go in and reclassify it, regroup it if you have specific properties there. And then also on top of that, we have what we call Assemble properties, and those are specific to our database and are persistent with each model version that's published. So notice that down in here, he had some properties that were not grayed out and able to edit. Any of the ones that are grayed out means that they're parametric in nature and are tied back to something else in the Revit model. So we actually prevent changing any of that set of data.
Jump back to, say, maybe structural, but turn off the color by property. So we've got a column selected. We go into the properties, and just like what Tim was saying, the Assemble properties, you can think of that as okay, that is the construction. That's where the construction team can own the information. So they can go and they can put in whatever information they want there, and they own that. And the nice thing about the Assemble properties is that you get different versions of the model and you upload new versions, you don't lose that information. You don't have to keep adding that information, and it's a great way that kind of overcomes the fact that it can be really hard to get any changes of the information upstream to the design side. And so you can go in and apply the information in the Assemble properties easy enough and not have to necessarily rely on the design team to make any of those changes. So that is another huge benefit to using Assemble, is that you can control that data and take ownership of it, and you can add, whatever it is. So now let's say that they wanted to go in, and I know we've got some Skanska Assemble properties, but that's something that you're able to help them customize as well. Correct, Tim?
Yeah, you have the ability, in the Assemble properties, you have the ability to create your own. So you can create templates across all of your projects, or default lists of properties. And you can also create model or project-specific properties that are specific to individual projects. That's all maintained or managed within your project settings. Chester's mentioning we could help. We used to actually require you needed to call into our support group, but that's now available in the edit project settings under manage assemble properties. Click that dialog. And I'll mention quickly one feature that we're rolling out really soon here is the ability to now group these. So you could create properties around, let's say, estimating or scheduling or value engineering. You could actually group your properties within those buckets. That'll be available really soon here.
Huge benefit of why you'd want to use Assemble is that you can take ownership of the information that's in the model. And if it doesn't exist, you can create it, and love that feature. One of the things that makes it a little bit easier to deal with the data is you've got the import-export functionality within Assemble, and that can kind of speed up the process of assigning the different parameters or information that you would want. So I use a lot of the VLOOKUP function, and you notice that you've got the option to export your files with instances or without. So I usually typically do both, and then I'll have one as like a master file, and then I'll use the VLOOKUP function in Excel to kind of pull in whatever other data I want. And don't you guys have some scripts that help out with that as well?
We actually have, and this I don't believe is new to you, but we also have a direct connection to Excel. We have an add-in that you can put in Excel, and it allow you from Excel to point to your Assemble website. So you do your login, and then you can basically point to your project and the set of data that you want to bring in. And so you can either download data directly from our database from a view, so that inventory you're looking at, or from a specific set of properties or a specific set of quantities, or a very specific quantity. You can plug it into a cell and actually have that updated every time the model gets updated or the aggregation gets updated. So a lot of flexibility around how we can move data in and out of Excel. And if you're familiar with the term ETL, extract, load, or extract, transform, load, basically it's our ETL tool for Excel. It allows you to do just about any sort of reporting out of Assemble that you'd want to do with Excel.
One other thing that I think is key for pushing, you can actually push data back upstream. And so if there's information that needs to be in the models, but the designers don't have the time to put it in, the construction side can use Assemble as a tool to go in and update, whether it be like uniform format assembly codes or some other type of information that's required on the project. It can be added in Assemble and then synced back into the models. And so I think that's a huge benefit. One of the ways that we've kind of used that is if we're going to go in and cost load a model. So we're not trying to pull or push the entire estimate back into the model, because frankly not everything gets modeled, so it would not be a complete estimate. But let's say that you're on the design side and you've got certain design options and things you want to look at. You can push that data back in, so the design team can go in and sync any of that information back, and then as they're making changes to the model, they can go in and see some pertinent information. But you kind of have to communicate back to them, say, hey, this is not the full estimate. And primarily this works better early on in the project, I think, for more of a high level conceptual. And what we're seeing here is probably a little more detailed than what we would even typically do. So I think that sync function is underused but hugely powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially when you're dealing with a contract or a project where you want to actually have all of this information managed within Assemble for your iterations, and then the final piece pushed over for delivery, or at any incremental stage pushed over for turnover, or for whatever that delivery mechanism may be.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it probably gets used more later on in the project,
That's
where
right.
you're putting together the turnover models, the as-built, and things like that.
Or anytime you're managing as a contractor, you're managing Revit parameters or model-based properties, and you want to keep those up to date. If you receive a new version from the design team, you can push those parameters back and then publish. So you have that ability to interact back and forth with a changing or evolving design, and keep your data up to date.
Yeah. So very, very flexible when you're utilizing the tools. So they're there. It just kind of depends on if the team's going to make use of them. Another thing, you mentioned some of your other integrations. I love Power BI and what you can do with it. It is so cool. So as great as visualizing things in the model can be in Assemble, and kind of color coding, this is a good way to kind of quantify the data a little bit more and digest it. And if you haven't gotten into Power BI, it's basically like Excel on steroids, what you can do like visualization wise, and it's very, very useful when it comes to digesting the data. And so right here you see this is just a basic. This is your template that Tim's team has put out, and I definitely recommend, once you get past the basics, to go in and start looking at customizing it, because you can customize it to whatever your workflow is. I've seen you guys do other webinars before, and there's different sets of the data that depending on your workflow, you would want to go in and customize. And
so for those of you that aren't aware, Power BI is a Microsoft tool. Microsoft Power BI is a dashboarding and reporting tool that's geared towards being able to aggregate a lot of different data and then represent it any way you want. As Chester mentioned, if you guys are interested, let us know, shoot us an email, or contact us, and we can give you access to our connector. And you can get started right away with the templates that we have in place, and build out whatever you want from there.
Pushing data into eBridge, your quantities, I think, I feel like we're just barely getting our feet wet on that. So that's an awesome integration. And then the thing that I love the most about Assemble is the fact that it is cloud-based, and it has the ability to integrate into all these other tools through the use of API and integration. So that's kind of it. I know we're probably out of time, but definitely look that up on, talk to Tim about the rest of that information, and just want to say thanks for your time. And
I do want to thank you, Chester, for joining us today, for sharing some of your experience and your expertise in using both Assemble and just generally in the industry around both collaborating with the design team and building out estimating data and everything you guys are doing at Skanska. We really appreciate it, and thanks for the time today.